Chapter 27. Jen. Jen could feel the armrest of the passenger door digging into her side as she did her best to make room for Taylor and Layla, who were pressed in between Jim and her left hip. After waiting for what seemed like an eternity, Tim had given the all-clear. Before she knew it, they were weaving in and out of the maroon vehicles littering the various roads Jim took to reach the Washington Street overpass. "There it is," Jim rasped in a whispery voice as he rounded a corner and sped up, heading directly towards Highway 101. Jen swallowed hard as the arc of the overpass came into view, signaling a gateway to freedom. A porthole out of harm's way. Whether that would prove true, she held no legitimate way of knowing. For now, she looked at that portion of their journey as something of a milestone they would soon pass and be closer to their destination. Two headlamps appeared from under the overpass, crawling up the side of the landscaped open area in the center of the off-ramp from southbound 101. Jim muttered a low curse as he downshifted, decreasing the vehicle's speed as they closed with a massive military vehicle. "Why are you slowing down?" Jen asked, not hiding her alarm. "We're screwed. We're too close." Jim pressed the brakes as the APC lumbered onto Washington Street, blocking their path to the east. As the truck came to a full stop, she felt a shiver rack her body as panic ravished her nervous system. She possessed very little in the way of tactical experience, so when she began running through possible escape scenarios, the list was short. She was smart enough not to draw on anything she'd seen on television or the movies and try to think rationally about what would work and what might end in one or all their deaths. 5 seconds after seeing the headlights, she knew they were in real trouble. "Who's that?" Taylor asked innocently as he and Layla strained to see out the front windshield of the truck. "Nobody good," Jim muttered, reaching for his door handle. Everyone in the truck started when a heavily accented voice yelled for them to exit the little truck. Outside the truck, Jen felt naked as they all stood silhouetted in the bright lights of the APC. More orders were given, and an Asian man wearing a military uniform came forward and shoved Jim towards the APC. When he turned on the Asian soldier, the soldier's weapon flashed up, striking him in the face. Jim dropped straight to the ground. Jen tried to stifle the scream that followed the merciless act, but her hands were slower than her voice, and the sound rang out across the quiet night air. That caused Layla to start crying as a second soldier moved in, pushing the Griffins toward the APC. In that moment, Jen knew she'd be required to call on every fiber of strength she'd ever had or thought she was capable of bringing to bear if she were to survive and safeguard her children. She was a realist and didn't think or wish for a single moment that Cam would come dashing in to save the day. She was truly on her own, and it would be her sole purpose in life to make sure they did not separate her from her children. When rifle shots sounded from behind, Jen knew Jim was dead, and it was all she could do not to turn back. She knew the sight of Jim's body lying in the street could not be unseen and would haunt her for years to come. She pulled her children's heads close to her sides, making sure their eyes faced the APC, the lesser of the two evils currently lurking on Washington Street. There would be terrible things in the world going forward, but the more of these gruesome tragedies she could avoid laying her eyes on, the better her mental state would fare. The soldier shoved her once in the back, and she pressed forward, both Taylor and Layla clutched tightly to her side. The soldiers guided them past the mammoth APC, across the landscaped area, then down the sloped terrain and beneath the overpass. Below Washington Street were several military trucks, another APC, several soldiers, and a litany of additional military equipment Jen couldn't identify. The soldiers herded them to the back of a truck and prompted them to climb in the back. The truck appeared to be some sort of troop carrier with light armor, but no weapon system on top. The back of the truck was covered, and once the 3 prisoners were inside, their captors closed the tailgate and dropped a tarp over the open space between the top of the tailgate and the truck's canopy. A moment later, the engine turned over, then roared to life. The truck lurched forward, making a hard U-turn before heading along the highway. Based on the U-turn, Jen knew they were heading north and promised herself she would try to keep some idea of where they were in her head based on time traveled since she couldn't see outside. She lowered her head in the darkness, and tears streamed down her face. It had to happen. and she wanted it out of her system before they arrived at wherever it was those bastards were taking her and her kids. The tears flowed as she cried silently, controlling any sobs for fear of further upsetting both children. The tears felt like they emptied from her stomach at first and then her chest. It was a good feeling, one of ridding herself of an emotion she would have no use for in her immediate future. Strength and wit would be the things she leaned hard on in the coming days. She would have no use for a single emotion in any way tethered to the damsel in distress mindset. Jen didn't kid herself. She wasn't a warrior like her husband, but she was a mama bear. She'd been raised by parents who'd routinely read Reader's Digest accounts of bears eating hunters to her, and she found some level of solace in knowing she was capable of much when she had to be. The time to fight was not now. Of that, she was certain. Now was the time to survive, observe, and collect the information she'd use to later extricate her family from this mess. Finished with her cry, she wiped a sleeve across her face, drying her tear-slicked cheeks. A change in the truck's engine pitch brought the vehicle's movements back to her attention. The truck left the highway, veered left onto what would have been an on-ramp, and slowed. As the truck came to an almost halt, she felt the driver make a sharp right turn, and the truck powered up an incline. She knew that would place them on the east side of Highway 101, the side she'd been desperately trying to reach when they'd been detained. It wasn't a lot, but she added it to her data to be used once she figured out how to separate herself from these monsters. Half a dozen more turns, and Jen was thoroughly confused and turned around. She felt fairly positive they hadn't recrossed the highway. This meant they'd still be on the east side and closer to Sonoma than had they been trucked to the west side of the highway. For that, she gave thanks. The crunch of gravel under the truck's tires signaled they'd left the road and were moving across an area with unpaved surfaces. The truck slowed even more and finally came to a halt. A KPA soldier pushed the tarp up and dropped the tailgate. He ordered the three out of the truck and clipped Korean sentences accompanied by gestures with the business end of his rifle. Jen grabbed her children by their jackets and pushed them toward the opening. As soon as they stepped down on the ground, powerful lamps stationed around the area blasted their eyes with bright lights. As Jen's eyes adapted to the glaring bright lamps, she realized they were in some sort of fairgrounds-type property. There were several animal corrals and a 4-H sign hung above the door to a building on her left. The soldier yelled at her again in Korean. Although she could not comprehend his words, she understood the soldier's gesticulations. He marched them toward a large building that looked like some sort of pavilion. At the front doors, they were all stripped of their backpacks, then searched more thoroughly than Jen would have liked. Everything in their possession except their clothing was taken, and they were pushed through the doors and into the large building. Inside were more lights. Chain-link fencing with razor wire spun across its top divided the interior in two. Soldiers were quartered in the front area of the building, while she and the children were being pushed toward the fence and the back of the building. In the center of the chain-link fence was a large gate, next to which stood two armed KPA soldiers. In front of the gate and off to the right was a large metal desk behind which sat a fat, ununiformed Korean man. The soldier ushered Jen to the front of the desk, where the fat man asked her in barely understandable English for her name and address. "Name, your name with birth time, address," the man spat as he opened a laptop computer and readied his pudgy fingers to input her information. "Jennifer, Griffin, August," she began before the man waved an angry hand in the air. "Slow! You speak slow!" he demanded, glaring at her. He placed his sausage-like appendages back on the keyboard. When Jen finished relaying her information to the impatient Korean man, she stood waiting as he typed, then depressed a button and sat back to wait. A moment later, he leaned toward the laptop screen, scrutinizing whatever information was displayed across its surface. Once he'd read his screen, he looked up and studied Jen before typing feverishly for another 10 seconds. When he'd finished, he looked up at Jen again, his pouched face evidence of his lifelong vice of bad cigarettes and even worse booze. "Husband!" Jen feigned ignorance until the man shouted the question a second time. "Dead," she replied, without knowing why she'd said it. Layla and Taylor's faces turned up to her, their shocked expressions not lost on the fat Korean man. "Truth! I want truth!" He slammed a fist on the desk's metal surface. A couple of soldiers standing close by looked over, but None of them seemed overly concerned with their pudgy comrades' B-movie antics. "They didn't know," she stammered, doing her best to look distraught, which wasn't far from what she was feeling at the moment. "They don't know. They don't know," she repeated, forcing herself into tears as she hugged her children close to her hips. The kids' eyes welled with tears, and then they streamed freely over the news of their father's death. They'd just seen him, and he'd promised he'd be coming to their grandparents' house soon to reunite the family. The Korean asked more questions, wanting to know why Jen was in California when she lived more than 2,000 miles away. He asked about how many weapons she owned and the whereabouts of those weapons. Jen didn't lie about that, knowing it didn't matter since she would never have access to those rifles and pistols again. When asked again why they were in town, she lied her ever-loving ass off and told the man she'd come to visit a friend in Napa Valley. The information she gave was true in the event the man had the ability to check her story out. That seemed to satisfy him. He finished typing, then called out in Korean to a guard standing near the gate. They were led to the back of the building, to an area with cots set up across the floor in rows. She was shown to a side door that led to the outside and 4 portable bathrooms surrounded by another high fence topped with razor wire. 2 soldiers were posted outside of the wire, in case anyone tried going over. Back inside the pavilion, only a small number of the 100-plus cots were occupied. The soldier roughly directed her to 3 cots next to another row where thin blankets covered other sleeping forms. There were worn blankets folded at the end of the cots, and Jen set about readying the beds for sleep as soon as the soldiers left. She tucked the kids in and covered them up, pressing her finger to their lips every time either started to ask about how she knew their father was dead. She wasn't sure if telling them the truth would help or hinder their situation, so she decided to sleep on it. If she couldn't sleep, she would at least think on the matter. Their real emotions would protect her lie for the time being, or at least until she could figure out their next course of action. With the children tucked in, Jen crawled into a 3rd cot and drew the blanket up under her chin, trying hard to relax her mind, body, and soul. Under its protective layer of insulation, the blanket's rough wool texture somehow made her feel safer from the cruel world only a few feet from her and her children. She soon succumbed to the debilitating fatigue brought on by her overwrought nerves. She slept next to her babies on a cot in a building 2,000 miles from home, a captive in her own country.